Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon to all of you, and maybe to some of you, at least to Patrick. Good morning. And welcome for our meeting today with Michael Bruder, professor in political science at the London School of Economics. And I'm super excited to have Michael in our lab today. I ordered his book recently. I haven't had a chance to read it, but I'm hoping that in this hour I will understand the gist of it. Michael has published extensively on political behavior, topics like emotions and identities, and I just want to highlight the abstract of one of his articles here, published in Nature Human Behavior in 2017, because I think it's really brilliant. It's very short, don't worry. To understand voting behavior, we must consider voters' emotions and their interaction with electoral arrangements and the complex functions elections serve in democracies. We can then optimize voting via electoral ergonomics, the design of electoral arrangements that consider voters' both bodies and minds. That sounds truly fascinating, and especially for inventing the word electro ergonomics. I think Michael deserves the credit together with his co-author, Sarah Harrison. So I'm really curious what you're going to talk about today, Michael. And for those of you who are new today to the Hot Politics Lab, there will be a presentation of about 20 minutes, after which you can ask your questions in the Q&A box. And Bert will further facilitate that. Without further ado, I want to give you the floor, Michael.
Thank you very much. Well, lovely to see Bert and Hayes. I cannot actually see the rest of you, but I know I'll get your questions and stuff anyway. So I'm just trying to find a place where I can share my screen, which I presume, there we go. So now it should work. And you should all be scared a little bit because the presentation today is about trying to mess things up a little bit. So, you know, as Hayes mentioned, it is about the book that Sarah Harrison and myself published just about 6 months ago, which is called Inside the Mind of the Voter. And I mean, there are a lot of different things we try to do with this book, but in particular, I would say that we try to be quite reflexive and identify some of the assumptions that we make without always realizing it in the field of political behavior, and try and tease out the implications of those assumptions and understand what happens when we relax them. That's pretty much what I'm going to talk to you about today. So I'm going to present you with some of the findings, but I'm also sort of trying to emphasize a bit, I would say, the big picture about some of the conceptual disruption, I guess, that Sarah and I wanted to bring to our field. And you know, in a way, he mentioned it in a very effective way when he mentioned the role of electoral ergonomics, which is one of the things we're really interested in. Now, the book started with a bit of an argument, in a way, not between us, but between ourselves and the publisher, Princeton, because we really wanted to call it Homo suffragator, and publishers don't like Latin title. I don't even speak Latin, but basically what we're trying to do is to highlight the fact that there is more to elections than people actually electing a party or a candidate. And I know that obviously in the Netherlands, you are in the middle of an electoral period. You've got an election in just under 4 weeks from now. It's going to be a messy one and so on. And everybody wants to know who is going to win and who is going to make a coalition. But one of the things we are saying is, well, you know, that's all very interesting for us as political scientists, as people who actually study power, as people who study institutions and government. But is it really the only question or the main question that we should ask ourselves when it comes to understanding elections and electoral behavior? And in fact, I'm going to propose to you that one of the very paradoxical things about the field of electoral behavior and political behavior in general, in the way it's emerged as a field within political science is that it's paradoxically very institution-centric rather than people-centric, right? The question of who is going to know an election, even the question of turnout, which is pretty much the only other one which we look at whether people are going to vote or not. I mean, those are the questions which are really important for the political parties, right? They really want to know whether they are going to win or to lose, who is going to vote for them or who is not going to vote for them. But if we think from the point of view of the people as individuals, should it not matter more to know if elections make them happy, for instance, whether they make them emotional, whether it can make them cry, whether it can actually ruin their life in general or their love life sometimes by breaking up with someone because of an argument about who to vote for? Does it not matter more to know whether elections give people the impression somehow, the sense that some societal problem has been resolved by the election? And all of you will have in mind the scenes from Washington, D.C. on the 6th of January, when a number of people marched on the Capitol, what was effectively an insurrection. What it was telling us really was that beyond the question of who wins the election, there was that sense that a number of people believed that somehow the election had not resolved the political crisis within the country. And if people have that impression, that's something which is really worrying. So the first assumption we make, I think, in the field of electoral behavior is that notion that effectively the dependent variable of interest is the question of who wins the election or who people vote for, depending on whether you look at the aggregate level or individual level version, and a little bit who is going to vote or not, or what's going to be the turnout, again, depending on whether you look at the individual or aggregate level. The second really big assumption that we make, and again, it is very institution-centric because it assumes that elections work in the way they were designed to work, or they were assumed to work by institutional designers, is that people vote for the political party that they prefer. Now, it sounds obvious when you say it like that. I mean, that's pretty much the entire understanding we have of electoral behavior is built on this assumption that people vote for the person they like best. But when you stop to think of it for a minute, I mean, there is nothing obvious about that assumption. I mean, all of us, at least on this particular, the people I see, I don't know about the audience, but we are, academics, and therefore, apart from being researchers, we're also teachers. And I don't think I'm betraying any secret when I say that, sometimes there might be some students we really like, sometimes there might be students we don't like as much. That's only human. But we don't give good marks to the students we like and bad marks to the students we don't like, right? That's not the way it works. The way it works is that when we mark an essay or an exam or something like that, we've got a function to fulfill, we've got a role to fulfill, and we try to do it the best we can. And why could we not consider that voters as well, rather than voting for the political party that they prefer, might be enacting a certain role, a certain understanding they have about the role of the voter, which may very well be subconscious. I mean, remember that over 90% of what we think and do in life, including in politics, is subconscious anyway. But this might mean that the person we actually vote for is not necessarily the person that we prefer. It's not necessarily the political party that we prefer, but maybe what we think corresponds to the right thing to do, for instance. And that's not just about the difference between egocentric and sociotropic voting, which all of you will be familiar with. It's about something deeper, something more complex about the meaning of the act of voting. Now, if for a second we decide to relax those two assumptions, that what matters about the vote is who you vote for and whether you vote or not, and the assumption that if you are going to vote, this is going to be in favor of the person that you prefer, then an entire house of cards of political behavior collapses. And many of the things we've taken from granted for much of the existence of political science as a discipline becomes not so certain anymore. I mean, this has immense conceptual, analytical, methodological implications. I mean, analytical implications because suddenly we need to think about whether there are some other dependent variables which might be worth our attention. it might require new methods, especially if we focus on those subconscious elements that I was telling you about. It might require some new concepts to embrace, for instance, that notion that voters may have a role in mind when they actually go to vote, or that their interaction with the political system and the design of elections is a little bit more complex than a simple case of electoral arrangements or electoral management on the one hand and free voters on the other hand. And it has very significant consequences, and I'll spend the next 10 minutes or 15 minutes telling you about all those things. So first of all, in terms of the book, the impact of what I've just been telling you about is that we try to change the dependent variable, and in fact, we do something which is not usually recommended in political science or social science in general, which is to not focus on one, but on 3 or in fact 5 dependent variables. And there are 2 aspects of electoral behavior, the traditional ones, so whether people will vote or not and who they are going to vote for, which we conceive in terms of both left, right, and moderate versus extremist. But we also focus on the electoral experience, and by that we mean whether elections make people happy or not, and whether they make them emotional or not. And we also focus on that concept I was bringing in passing a few seconds ago of electoral resolution, which is that feeling that people may or may not have, that an election is bringing closure in a way, that it's putting an end, if you want, to something which has been splitting society for a whole range of reasons. But those are the dependent variables. The advantage of looking at 3 dependent variables, or 5 again, if you sort of look at the 2 different aspects of behavior and 2 aspects of experience we're interested in, is that it also enables us to actually include a dynamic model where we look at the impact of any 2 of the dependent variables at time 0 on the 3rd one at time 1. In other words, does the fact that an election in 2016 made you happy, for instance, mean that you're more likely to turn out in the election in 2020? Or is the fact that you voted for the winner or the loser in 2016 mean that you are going to have a greater likelihood of a sense of closure in 2020 and so on? That's the sort of complexity, if you want, that having those dependent variable means. In terms of what we're interested in personality, but we try to move away from the big 5 because we just think that in a way, we always take it for granted that personality means big 5, and that's not necessarily the only way to think about it. So we look at a number of discrete personality traits. We also look a lot at moral hierarchization, the notion that some people, I mean, we all think that, we shouldn't be killing, we shouldn't be, cheating, we shouldn't be stealing, but people may have different hierarchies between those things. And we use funky things like asking people to rank the 7 deadly sins, or the 6 moral of the 10 commandments and so on, to try and understand how people hierarchize those things. We look at electoral memory. Again, in political science, we've always reduced electoral memory to, do you remember the way you voted last time? But there is plenty of research in psychology about memory. And what we know is that there are effectively 3 main types of memories, which are visual, auditive, and haptic. So in other words, you remember what you see, you remember what you hear, and you remember what you touch. None of them is really about remembering what you do. And in a way, the last thing you should be remembering from past elections is really who you voted for. But there are plenty of other things you could be remembering, either consciously or subconsciously, which might be sort of influencing your future behavior. And we focus in particular on memories from childhood and the memory of the first election, first time you get a chance to vote. There is that notion of electoral identity. So, a number of things here, but among the concepts we're looking into. So for those of you who are, aware of the mainstream political behavior literature, we've got obviously a notion of partisan identification, which is, coming from Campbell, Converse, Miller, and Stokes' Michigan model of the vote, which is that people identify with a party. Now, I spent many of my early research years studying identities, notably European identity and stuff like that. I can tell you one thing. I mean, I did study identities in so many ways, including narratives. When you ask people to talk about their identity, they don't mention the party they vote for. And to me, that's just not a likely element of identity in a traditional sense. But the fact that you don't identify with a political party doesn't mean that you don't have an identity as a voter. And it goes back to what I was asking earlier about the role that people embrace. And the way we try to capture it is by, in particular, playing a little role play with voters and say, well, imagine that the parties running in the election are the teams in a football game, and they are sort of fighting for your vote. How do you see your own role in that game? Do you see yourself as a supporter who is cheering one of the parties, or do you see yourself as a referee? And guess what? People really do fall into those categories. And depending on whether you are a referee or a supporter, this is going to affect the way you are going to experience the campaign, the way you are going to experience the election, the way you are going to think about other voters, and so on. We also look at the notion of what we call empathic displacement. It sounds like an ugly word, but it's about trying to reconcile the individual and societal dimensions of the vote. I mean, again, we've tended to think of them as very separate, almost two different levels. But what we say is that even if voting is an individual thing, at the time when you vote, you might be thinking about the way the rest of the country is voting. You might project yourself. You might try to figure out how your vote, people are sophisticated. They can actually make this sort of mind games, which can give them a sense about how they believe, they fit within society, and how they will actually be either alienated or integrated by their votes, depending on what the rest of the population is doing. And in the same way, we look at another element, which we are quite keen on, which is the notion of projected efficacy as well. Now, again, you're all familiar with the notions of both internal and external efficacy, and one of them, the external element, is that notion that, well, effectively your vote is likely to make a difference. And as we know, many people who do rational choice say, well, it doesn't make sense. Your vote is very unlikely, that's happened by the way, but very unlikely to make a difference to the outcome of the election. But what we say is that this is oversimplifying the way in which people think, because when you think about the importance of your vote, it doesn't need to be individual either. And again, the image I would use is, I don't know, for those of you who have children, for instance, you might have seen kids throwing a paper on the street, and, you tell them, well, you can't do that, pick it up and, wait till you get to a rubbish bin. And they will say, well, it's only a small piece of paper. And then at one point in your life, you will have said something like, imagine if everyone is doing the same thing. And projected efficacy is that. It's imagine everyone is doing the same thing. It doesn't mean that you actually think that your individual vote is going to make a difference, but it means that you think that if every other young person in the country is also giving up and abstaining, then it's only old people who are going to decide the outcome of the election, for instance. And we think that this is actually, again, a potentially very powerful thing, electoral ergonomics. I'm going to accelerate because otherwise I'm going to spend all my time just on this sort of theoretical model. But methods, I mean, we use plenty of stuff. We do panel study surveys across countries, specific surveys on first-time voters. We do some visual experiments. I quite like that one. We partnered with some professional filmmakers, and we filmed the shadow of people in the polling booth to analyze their facial expression and body language at the time when they vote, without being able to identify their face or seeing the person they vote for. And we use the body of literature, which has been used in both medicine and anthropology to try and interpret that. We do some lab experiments, we do some field experiments, we do in-depth interviews, spot interviews. We speak to thousands of people on the day of the election, asking them a very, I would say, almost psychoanalytical question, which is, can you tell me in one sentence what went through your mind when you were in the polling booth? And we do things like diaries, asking people to keep a diary for a period of 3 weeks every day, or even direct observation, partnering with people who work in polling stations and asking them to tell us what people say, what people ask, whether they smile, how they dress, how they come to vote, and so on, and trying to actually analyze that systematically. I'll skip the concept because I've been mentioning many of them. I just mentioned, well, maybe one more, which is probably important, is electoral atmosphere. We're really keen on that because, people, I mean, obviously in political behavior studies, we do think a lot about context, but context is about what's happening. And when we talk to people, a lot of them refer to the atmosphere of the election. And we always dismiss that as almost too impressionistic to be worth a scientific study. But the reality is that in many other disciplines, they do take atmosphere seriously. You know, in marketing, in theater, in everything. I mean, they know very carefully, they study very carefully how lighting, how you know, the positioning of different things, how space is affecting the perceived atmosphere or something. And we want to do the same about elections as well. A few results, and I'm going to mention them very quickly just to have you know, a quick sense, to give you time to ask the question. So quick thing about what people think about when they're in the polling booth. I mean, the book is actually focused on 6 countries: US, UK, France, Germany, South Africa, and Georgia. And as you can see, it's actually quite varied, but in particular, the thoughts that people report spontaneously having in the polling booth often tend to be quite emotional, which is actually quite interesting, and quite prospective as well. So they tend to actually be talking a lot about the future. And another very important thing, they tend to be very positive. So even people who hate politics tend to actually enjoy election very often, which is something which is important to remember when we assume that we are the only ones being excited and interested by an election being run. Those notions are also affected by the way in which people vote. And in other words, what is particularly relevant here is that when you think about forms of remote voting, like allowing somebody to vote in advance, or on the contrary, allowing them to vote remotely, postally, using a postal ballot or internet vote, the emotions of people who go to a polling station are generally far more positive than the ones who actually vote from home using either a postal ballot or an internet vote. And they also tend to vote in a way which is much more sociotropic when they go to a polling station compared to voting from home. Evolution of empathic displacement, as I was mentioning, it's that notion that people, when they think about the election, are thinking about what the rest of the country is doing, what other people are doing. What is really interesting here is that it keeps growing as you go through the election period. And that, again, has a really important implication in the context of postal voting, which is that people who vote in the final week, of the electoral period, so quite a while after most postal votes will have been cast, tend to be far more likely to think about the societal dimension of the election, and they also tend to be far more sociotropic. Quick one, just for fun, the proportion of people who've already cried because of an election that was asked before Brexit, and you see already it was about 45% in France. Just to give you an indication, just for the Brexit referendum alone, a third of our respondents said that they had tears in their eyes because of the referendum. That included both people who were happy and people who were sad. That proportion was over 45% among people aged 18 to 24. So elections get people a lot more emotional than we typically assume. As we know, that emotionality is not opposed to their rationality, but rather it shapes it, and the two actually work hand in hand, and that's why it is so important. And equally, you can see, we've sort of done some tracing using panel study in terms of the evolutions of people's emotions and thoughts throughout the election cycle. And as you can see, as I was mentioning, at T3, which is about 1 week before the vote, you get those people becoming a lot more emotional, a lot more projective, a lot more sociotropic, a lot more atmospheric as well in their thoughts compared to the beginning of the election. So there is a lot happening. And in fact, in our research, we find that between 20 and 30% of the people either make up or change their mind in the last week of the election, of the electoral period, and up to half of that, so between 10 and 15% on election day itself. I mean, striking finding, there were more people changing their mind between 1 week before the Brexit referendum and referendum day than between referendum day and 2 years later, just to give you a sense about the important volatility of that final week. How did it work at the end? Well, that's a very ugly figure to show what works and what doesn't work in our model. We've tried to make it as user-friendly as possible, which is not very much. But effectively, it shows you that when you start adding all these elements of personality, identity, memory, and so on, they actually do have a significant impact on elements of electoral behavior, electoral experience, but also that all-important sense of electoral resolution. That's if Q1 version, which has coefficients in it. And you can see that we've got pretty good models in the end. I mean, this is based on the US models, just because that's where we've got the most comprehensive study. And as you can see, we've included the notion of electoral ergonomics by doing separate regressions for people who voted in person on election day, in person but in advance, and using postal ballots to be able to compare the impact of different aspects on all those forms of voting. And the final one is the one about the dynamic contribution. As I was telling you, it's about the way in which what happens at a given election, notably in terms of, for instance, whether you are happy with the election, whether you took part in the election or not, and so on, whether you had a sense of electoral resolution from the election at time zero, how this is going to affect what's going to happen to you at the next major election. And as you can see, apart from the model having quite a number of interesting coefficients, there is also a very important dynamic element, which in a way we believe tends to justify the fact that we want to focus on such questions as the experience of voters and the sense of resolution, even for people who are mostly interested in the sort of traditional behavioral outcome of understanding who people will vote for and whether they will vote at all. So I'm going to stop here just so that we have enough time for questions and answers. I have no idea why I wrote merci.
Thanks, Michael. This is fascinating. So for those of you who are new, you can write a question for Michael in the Q&A box, and then I will read it out, and Michael will give an answer. And while you, so Nienke, I saw you raise your hand. That's what we do in class, right? Nienke is one of my students. You can type the question in the Q&A box, and then I will read it out. Michael, I have a question for you. Well, other people might think about their questions. So did you also track people after the election, and what does happen with, for instance, these evaluations of the atmosphere and the emotionality after the outcome? And does it matter if your team or your party wins or loses for your evaluation?
So we did it a bit in some of the aspects of the research. So I mean, first of all, we've got the panel study. We actually trace people over several years. It goes up to 5 years in a country like the UK. We did it over a period of 2 years in the US, and so on. So for those, we didn't have a wave a few weeks after the election. We had one just after the election, and then the next one was the following year. And then we did a bit more in terms of following days for the people who had diaries and so on. The interesting thing is that, in fact, in most cases, whether you were supporting the winning or losing party did not make as big a difference as what we would expect. And in fact, there was one thing which is really interesting, that in most elections, when there is a general sense of electoral resolution, both winners and losers end up being much more positive about the concept of election itself. So one of the questions we ask, I mean, you know, we're really keen on some implicit and also open-ended questions. So we ask people, you know, when you think of the word election, when you hear the word election, what are the first 3 words that come to your mind, for instance? And then we sort of recode them and analyze them. And what is really interesting is that when you look at the answer people gave you about 3 weeks before the election, those connotations were very negative: corrupt, boring, blah, blah, blah. When you ask the same question the night after the election, the connotations are far more positive. And that was true both of people whose candidate won and people whose candidate lost. To the point that we actually derived, you know, I can't really say a hypothesis because we didn't test it, but a hypothesis to be tested maybe, which is that, you know, the whole concept many of us are familiar with of electoral honeymoon, right? That when somebody has been elected for a 100 days or something like that, they tend to get a lot of support. Well, Sarah's and my perception is that, in fact, this is not people converting. It's not people who, you know, who hated Boris Johnson before and now suddenly like him or something like that. But it's just that the election itself is, if it brings resolution to the people, if it brings closure, then it re-legitimizes the system, and it's that sort of process legitimacy in a way which creates the electoral honeymoon. In other words, people sort of accept that this is the outcome of a process which they support, and as a result are willing to give the person a chance. And what is really interesting is that there are a number of elections, like the Brexit referendum, like the Trump election of 2016. We haven't analyzed the result for the 2020 election yet, but I suspect that would be the same, which didn't bring that sense of closure. And in that case, it also doesn't bring an electoral honeymoon to the people. In other words, nobody, well, at least the people who were opposed to the outcome which won are not willing to give that winner a chance.
Right. Gijs, I think you also wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you to discuss a bit more something you mentioned very quickly in passing, namely the experiment you did with where you looked at body poses of people. Can you
the visual experiment? Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I must say, I must apologize for that. I think I passed on pretty much everything very quickly. I think I sort of tried to pile up a bit too much in a 20 minutes presentation. So thanks for bearing with me as well. Yeah, we were quite excited about that. I mean, it's the idea, the problem, if you want, we were trying to solve is that obviously the whole point of electoral behavior, especially if you look at that traditional question of who are people voting for, right, is really targeting one very specific moment, which is the time when somebody is casting their vote, which is the one moment which we are completely unable to capture as a discipline. So there is something very paradoxical, inherently paradoxical in trying to focus so much attention on the one moment you don't actually study, right? You use what people tell you before, you use what people tell you after, but there is a taboo around that moment. And we're trying to figure out, well, can we do anything about that? And obviously, one thing we can't do is just to put a camera on people at the time they vote, because, that would sort of breach their, the confidentiality and the secrecy of the vote. And so that's where we try to actually work things backwards and say, well, but in fact, the problem is you shouldn't be able to see who people vote for, and you shouldn't even be able to recognize them. But can we actually work around that potentially? And that's how we came with the idea that, if we could just look at the shadow of people in the polling booth, we might be able to actually see something about their emotions, like, whether they hesitate or how long they think before casting their vote and stuff like that. And so the only way we could do it, and I did it originally thanks to a conference which actually provided me with, well, it's not money, but they gave me cameramen, people who actually shoot films, like real movies, really cool people. And, the good thing about it is that those people know how to actually set up a scene with a full curtain so that you can actually have a crisp vision of someone inside a polling booth with enough detail that you can actually analyze their facial and body language, but enough complete darkness that you can never recognize who they are and never see who they vote for. And so we use it to analyze their emotions there. We also analyzed it as a true experiment in a way by making people vote in 3 different ways. Some people used an electronic voting machine. Some people used the type of ballot paper which we have in the UK, which I believe you have in the Netherlands as well, which is like a list and you sort of tick a box. And the third type of people had ballot papers like we have in France or in Israel, which is like individual pre-printed ballot paper. You pick one, you put it in the envelope. And what was really interesting is the time that people think before casting their vote. You give them exactly the same information at the beginning and so on. There is, no difference in the practicality of the act of voting. But with the voting machine, on average, people think for about 20 seconds, then they cast their vote. With the British type ballot, they think for 30 seconds, and then they cast their vote. And with the French ballots, they think for 1 minute, 3 times longer than with the voting machine, and then they cast their vote. So there is something as well about the way in which you design, and that goes back to that element of electoral ergonomics, which is what we wanted to study there. People don't think that it makes a difference. They might think that it might make it easier, harder, it might make it more likely that people will make an error when they vote or something like that. But they assume that all these choices are neutral. And with the concept of electoral ergonomics, what Sarah and I are trying to say is that all the small details, which are apparently benign and irrelevant, can change the psychological mechanisms which are being triggered at the time when people vote, which is why we really emphasize the fact that electoral ergonomics is not just electoral arrangements. It's about the interface between electoral arrangements and the psychology of the people. And in fact, more than that, we emphasize the fact that very often we misunderstand the very notion of ergonomics in sort of, everyday life. We think that ergonomics is about matching an object or a process to the human body. But what we say is that the real ergonomics is to match an object to the human body given the function of that object. So, I'll take an example. It never works with background on Zoom because this thing is too clever and it will work here. So I'm holding a bottle of water here, right? If you can see it. And you can't, maybe you can. This fits my hand perfectly. If designing an ergonomic pen was just about designing a pen which would match my hand, this is what a pen would look like, but I wouldn't be able to write. And it's exactly the same with elections. You need to think about the design, the ergonomics of elections, according to how people want to use them. And there are so many different ways in which people use elections. It can be about choosing someone. It could be about kicking someone in the backside. It could be about, being strategic. It could be about protesting about something. It could be about feeling part of society. It could be about trying to feel that somebody is listening to you up there for at least one day every 3 or 4 years. All these things are different functions that people can associate with elections. And that's what we wanted to bring back into that line of thought, really.
There's a question from Matthijs Rodan. Thank you, Michael. Fascinating research. Could you tell us a bit more about the electoral atmosphere? I like this idea a lot. To illustrate the idea, you use the metaphors stage and its lighting and position. But could you tell us more about how exactly you use this concept in your work and how you operationalized it?
So the electoral atmosphere part, well, first of all, Matthias, thanks, because I like the concept a lot as well. I think that it is, and I like it again because it's something that the people spontaneously refer to. And I think that, I think in the way we think about our research, we try to listen a lot to what people tell us without realizing. And people comment the atmosphere of the election all the time. Both in the media, but also in interviews and stuff like that. So that particular aspect of the research is a bit in its infancy. So we're doing two things. First, we're actually asking people in surveys, how they would characterize the atmosphere of the election. And then in a sort of exploratory way at the moment, we are trying to code loads of different things, from sentiment analysis of social media all the way to legal cases and protest, violence, the tone of debates. So we're thinking of, I can't remember how many we are, but we are over 150 different variables which we are looking at, and then we are aiming in due time, when we finish that part of the research, to try and see which of those sort of objective measures match the perceived atmosphere as described by the people in the survey. So that's the way we are trying to do it. So we try to open all the gates really of information, all the things that could actually create an atmosphere. And then we ask people to characterize it. We also ask it qualitatively in some ways, but we mostly do it quantitatively to have some robustness in the measurement. And our aim, but that will be the next book, is to try and see if we can match the two. But we still wanted to sort of mention that concept in this particular book, just because, for us, it was a bit of I'd say almost a bit of a manifesto. That sounds really pretentious when I say it like that, but, just trying to disrupt the way we do things a bit and ask people to think again, maybe about some of the stuff which we are still missing in, it's a very crowded field, but we still think that there is plenty we can do. Thank goodness for all of us, by the way. So, that's the goal. So I'm also very keen on any suggestion about what we could be looking at, by the way, in terms of operationalizations. If anybody has got good suggestions, always interested to hear them.
Michael, could I still go back a little bit to the thing that happened in the voting booth, because that is the part that also really resonates with me. And I remember having to vote abroad when I lived in Denmark for a couple of years, and I thought I had prepared myself well, and I went into the booth and I filled out my local municipality choice, and then it turned out they'd given me 2 pieces of paper. And I totally did not realize I also had to vote for the provincial level elections, which was a total confusion to me. So I spent a lot of time in the voting booth thinking through what I should now do. I'll let the partisanship decide in the end. But I was wondering, the difference you described between the 3 different modes are kind of that are big differences, right? In terms of this, that is not milliseconds. We're talking substantial. Do you have any idea of why presenting why these differences occur across these 3 different modes that you described earlier in response to Gijs's question? Is that because there's more to see, that people think more, or is it something else?
So we've got some hypotheses and we've got some ideas, but they are to an extent difficult to check at this stage, just because this has been a very expensive experiment to run, and so we've done it twice. We've done it in Germany and we've done it in the UK, and we intend to do more of it. But to do it well is a bit complex, just because of the the sort of skill in a way which is needed. And we have 2 main ideas. One is about the difference between the electronic and the paper, and the other one is between the multi-ballot and the single ballot paper. So the one where you've got 1 paper and the one when you've got several of them. Pardon me. The electronic versus paper, we think that our findings actually resonate quite well with other things we know about the difference between online and paper version of things. For instance, in survey research, we know that people, when they are filling in a survey on paper, are paying more attention. They are being more careful and so on. So I don't really know why, but it's something which has been quite well evidenced, and we think that this is what is being, what is at stake here. In terms of the single paper and the single ballot or multi-ballot paper, our suggestion is based on priming. The idea that when you have a single ballot, we think that the priming reflexes of voters are more easily at stake, because you will spot the name you're sort of looking for very easily. And we think that when you have several ballot papers, when you've got 9 individual papers and you need to actually look at them, we think that it forces people to look at everything more carefully, as opposed to letting the priming reflex lead their behavior. But again, that's the way we explain it, but it's very difficult to prove for us at this stage, which has been one of the things we've been struggling with. But you're right, there are big effects. And by the way, big effects with big consequences as well, because, we did it in the context, we did it for, in an experiment, so it's a fake election. We assume people were choosing, the new leader of the European Commission. They had 7 candidates from the main parties and so on. 1 minute is a pretty long time for 1 vote. Imagine what happens when you're in the US and people have to cast 50 different votes in 1 ballot paper. You are mentioning the 2 you had in Denmark, but in the US, for any of you who've seen US ballot papers, they are crazy. And it's very usual for people to spend over half an hour in the polling booth, because they need to, if they want to vote on everything, from, whatever the dentist's checking association or whatever, to to the local judge and so on. It takes a very long time. So obviously, one of the things we found, by the way, is that in terms of emotions, the people who were given the electronic ballot paper were less satisfied and were showing, sorry, not less satisfied, they were, the emotions that they were expressing were less positive than those who were given paper ballots. And those with the French type ballot actually were even more positive than the ones who were given a single ballot. So in a way, the length of deliberation was also correlated with the positiveness of the and the level of emotionality of people, which was really quite interesting to us. So in principle, that could be a good thing. But in terms of electoral management, obviously people who organize elections are always very worried about queues in polling stations, especially in countries like the US. And obviously, you could argue that in a context like the US precisely, it might make it the recommended version in a way to use electronic voting machines, which I don't tend to like very much, but which might at least sort of shorten the time people spend in the polling booth. Well, in other countries. I mean, obviously in the Netherlands, I can't remember, I think we've got like 37 or 38 lists to choose from at the next election. I mean, that can make the sort of French ballot paper a little bit awkward. Mind you, I mean, they do it in Israel where they have even, this very often similar number of parties and coalitions running than yours. And what they do is that they sort of put it on the wall. They have single letters or two letters on a piece of paper representing one list, but that requires a certain level of sophistication and education on the part of the voters who need to sort of know what letter will correspond to what party. So I'm always surprised they can get away with it. They can apparently, and it seems to work well. So yeah, it can also lead to those really different impacts in different contexts depending on what you need to vote for, I suppose.
Gijs, you're going to ask a question now?
Oh, yeah, sorry. I wasn't aware you were waiting for me. I just wanted to ask, what did you guys say a bit more about the role of personality? I mean, it was part of all these black arrows, but
yes.
didn't quite catch how personality is important in this whole process.
So, I mean, it was a bit complex because we had so many measures, but I think that the bottom line, or maybe, a simple line is that we felt that introducing personality traits worked better than just focusing on the big five. I mean, there have been quite a bit of research on the big five and the vote, and it has often been disappointing to people. And our argument is that the big five were never meant to be the be all and all of measuring personality. That's not the way psychologists use it. And in political science, I think we're so impressed in a way when we start looking at psychological questions that we sort of, take it for granted that must be the sort of miracle solution. But so we looked at a number of different, discrete personality traits like care, for instance. We looked at, I can't remember what's the full list. I mean, we had some which sort of mirrored the big five, like anxiety, but some of the other ones were a little bit more specific, and they tended to work, a little bit. Yeah, I mean, they had different effects as well in different countries, which was a bit surprising, and they tended to have effects on all three types of models. So the behavior, the experience, and the resolution one. One thing that worked really well as well was the moral hierarchization. So I don't know if you count that as part of personality or not. I mean, for us, it's the same chapter, but it's a bit of a different thing. And that actually worked really well. And what was really interesting there is we derived a sort of conclusion from it and from our research in general, which is sort of cheerful, which is that we think that elections bring the best out of people, even the people who don't vote like us. And therefore we would tend to dismiss as doing something wrong because, in many ways they might be voting for an extremist party and so on. Many of them are really trying to do their best, and they are actually approaching elections usually very seriously, a lot more seriously than we usually assume. And we think that this is both a good thing and a bad thing, because what we realize is that the different patterns of moral hierarchization were really heavily related to the way in which people vote. And as a result, what happens is that when people blame other voters for current project on electoral hostility and the fact that, and we don't, by the way, we are voluntarily moving away from the effective polarization model, because I think the effective polarization model stems from partisanship. And what, Sarah and I are saying is, no, in fact, it's not about partisanship. You can have some people who don't even give a shit about politics, but still hate people who vote in a certain way. And we think it's really derived from cynicism, which was originally targeting politicians, then institutions, and is now affecting voters as well. So it looks the same when you observe it, but it actually, the theoretical assumption and the psychological cycle are very different. And so what we are saying is that the problem is that as a result, very often voters, when they look at people who voted differently from them, they derive a sense of moral wrong in a way from the way others are behaving electorally. In other words, there is that incompatibility between different sets of moral hierarchies, which means that when somebody votes for the party you don't like, you can actually have a tendency to think that this person is in fact immoral. And that stems from that sort of, incompatibility of what you think is really important. And the point is that if you ask people, do you think we should kill others, or do you think we should steal from others and so on, then of course everybody will say no. But when you force people to hierarchize things, when you actually force them to arbitrate between apparently positive things or negative things which are in tension with one another, then they disagree about what is an absolute, non-negotiable moral priority. And therefore, the people who vote for something else, which betrays that non-negotiable moral priority, they interpret as a largely immoral vote.
So, Michael, last week, Jana Krupnikov was here with us, and she talked a lot about her work on effective polarization. But in passing, you mentioned something that I thought was striking about your ideas on identity, and said, well, how central are party identities to who we are, and if so, how important are they? There's a big literature on effective polarization in the US. It's coming to Europe right now. Like, there's effective polarizations in country XYZ coming at us in but so how do you look at what it's an open-ended question from, well, how do you look at this role, how we're treating sort of party identity and the effective polarization compared to how you think about identity in politics?
Well, I think that, that's exactly the point, in a way, that, the effective polarization model assumes that you start hating each other because you're moving apart as groups and as political parties. And what we are suggesting is that, in fact, what happened is that, about 20, 30 years ago, people started hating politicians and thinking that they are, really corrupt, cynical, self-serving bastards. Then about 10 years ago, that led people to start developing serious mistrust towards institutions, which before people disliked the politicians, but less the institutions themselves. And now we think that this is being extended to voters themselves. And we think that the difference is that with electoral hostility as opposed to effective polarization, you can even have people who dislike people who vote for the party they support. In other words, you could very well be a Labour voter, but really think that many Labour supporters are idiots. It's not incompatible. You could be an abstentionist and think that Labour supporters are idiots. And if you start thinking of it that way, it's a bit different. And so we focus a lot more instead on the psychological cycle of frustration. And what this means is that we are building that sort of theoretical model where we suggest that at the beginning, people feel that they can't understand certain voters. Then they start feeling frustrated by them. Then they start feeling angry. Then they start feeling either contemptuous or hateful. Well, not hateful, but disgusted. And the final stage of the hostility process is when they start feeling hateful. So, you've got that sort of evolution of things, which, if they are not repaired early on, will keep degenerating. And so we think as well of electoral hostility as a self-degenerating phenomenon, in a way, regardless of parties' positioning. So in other words, we think that even if political parties move closer together, that does not actually repair electoral hostility, while it would supposedly repair affective polarization, for instance. So we tend to dismiss a little bit party identification. I mean, that's, you know, there is a big debate on whether party ID is a useful variable or not. I'm among the people, maybe because I'm European, who thinks that it's a very contextualized variable. And, you know, when you ask people time and again in many multi-party systems, it will change the party they say they feel closest to, and therefore that doesn't strike me as really a measure of identity. You know, imagine, how would you even consider party identity in the way it's used in the American political science literature when you think of a party system like France, when we suddenly had, you know, a completely new phenomenon appearing completely out of the blue, with Macron, who was not affiliated with any of the traditional political parties, when you think about all the new parties emerging and so on. So I think, by the way, it has really important implications, that replacement of, in our model, of party identity by electoral identity, which is that if you believe in a party identity model, if somebody votes for, say, the Republicans in 2012 and the Democrats for the Republicans in 2016 and the Democrats in 2020, then under a party identification or partisanship umbrella, you analyze their behavior as incoherent. And what we are saying is that you can vote for different parties and be entirely coherent. Maybe your coherence is that you always vote for the person who is not in power. That's a completely coherent, logical thing to do. And I think that when you sort of, you know, open that question of whether the identity of voters could exist without being tied to their partisanship, then it opens a completely new set of possibilities as to what can make them coherent, I guess.
Okay, that's very interesting stuff, especially given the fact that we have elections indeed coming up here in the Netherlands soon. And you're right, I think we have something like 45 parties on the list, so that will be a huge sheet of paper that everybody...
Even more than I thought.
And there's one particular thing that I can actually recommend to you, because we've now, because of Corona, the 70-year-olds are allowed to vote by post for the first time, I think, in the Netherlands. And what I can particularly recommend is the explanatory video that the government made, because apparently you need to fold your vote into an envelope, and that envelope needs to be put in another envelope. And so this is explained by some actor. And when the actor is finished, he's like, does like this big frown, like. So I think lots of people, the over 70s, will be quite disappointed by this whole procedure.
Yeah, that's something. So yeah, if you have the link to it or something, because
yeah, I need to look it up. It was on a TV show where I saw it, but it's very funny. Well, depressing actually, but thanks.
Yeah, but I suspect I'll find it interesting. I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Michael. This is super fascinating stuff. And as always, our speakers get the infamous Hot Politics coffee mug as a thank you for being here. I don't have an exemplar here. No, I don't have one.
You can send me a photo.
you will get it once I don't know, the borders open up again.
That will be with pleasure. That will be, you know, proudly sitting on my desk.
Great. Let me end today with announcing our next meetings. Next week there will be no meeting because there's a school holiday. And so our next meeting will be March 5th with Gerben van Kleef, professor of psychology at the University of Amsterdam. And he will talk about when we prefer risk takers as leaders. And the week after that, March 12th, we have Ben Ruys, also a psychologist from the University of Leiden. Then Lou Safra from Sciences Po Paris. And then March 26th, last meeting in March, we'll have a Graduate Friday again with Sanne van Oosten and our webmaster, Christian People. And Sanne will talk about an MP who looks like me, how intersections of race, religion, and gender shape expectations and experiences of representation. Okay, maybe my first advice would be a slightly shorter title. And Christian, what will you talk about actually? I took you by surprise there. Yeah?
I'll talk about emotional rhetoric in Parliament.
Of course, yeah. Okay, I want to wish everyone a good weekend, and thanks for joining us today. See you in 2 weeks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, Michael. Thanks.